What's going on, everybody? My name is Viking Dev, or Mitch, or whatever you want to call me on the internet. I've gone by many and many a name, and Viking Dev is probably the nicest one that I'm going to get. So I'm Viking Dev. I am a Python developer and have been for several years. I have developed everything from web scrapers to study Chinese social media censorship to right-wing extremism in the States, to all kinds of other different subjects. I am actually currently releasing a course that might be out by the time you watch this video. If it is, I will leave a link in the description, all about web scrapers built in Python. The course is titled Scrape the Planet, and if you want, you can go check it out. This series is going to be a little bit different. I've been writing Python for years and years and years. Like I've said, I've written all kinds of projects in Python, and I'm going to continue writing all kinds of advanced projects in Python. However, I acknowledge that not everybody knows Python. I'm actually teaching several classes to younger kids on the basics of Python and how to kind of learn coding using Python. And it's actually opened up my eyes a lot to some things that I didn't understand as well as I thought I did, and to kind of how to teach Python correctly. So in this course, or in this series, can't call it a course since it's on YouTube, in this series, we're going to be talking about Python from the basics, completely from scratch. You don't have to know a thing except for, the fact that you want to learn Python. So we're going to start from the very beginning, how to install Python. And just like all good things, it starts with a Google search. So let's switch over to our web browser here, and let's search for install Python. So very first result right here is from python.org. That is obviously the official release, and the most recent release is 3.9.7. So I personally would recommend going for that. There's kind of a rift in between people who write in Python 2.7, and I think they normally just call it Python 2, and the normal people who write in Python 3. So 3.9.7 is the most recent one. If you're doing this on Windows, fairly easy. Just grab the installer right here. If you're doing it on Ubuntu or any other kind of Linux installation, I believe you can just use sudo apt-get install python 3. And I believe that is the easiest way to do it. But there are essentially installers for every version here. And the cool thing about Python is that it comes with idle. Idle is what's called an IDE, and we're going to open it up right here. This is idle 3.7, so it's actually not the most recent version of Python. So let me drag this over here. And what an IDE is it stands for an Integrated Development Environment. And as soon as you install Python, this comes pre-installed, so you can go ahead and start writing code in Python just from the get-go. It starts off in what's called an interactive mode. And what interactive mode is instead of writing code in files like you'll see later on, you're going to write each line of code line by line in the terminal right here. So when we start going over variables, that will become a little bit more evident. But right now I'm just kind of speaking gibberish. Let's start off with Python code. So we're going to talk about variables first, because variables are kind of the foundation of all of programming, essentially. You really can't do much at all without variables. There are some programming languages that don't use variables as much, but Python is a fairly normal programming language in that it depends pretty heavily on variables. The way I teach variables is they're like buckets. So I'm going to draw a very poor looking bucket here. It looks more like kind of like a flower pot. This is basically how I've grown accustomed to drawing them. So you've got a bucket here, and this bucket is your variable. And this bucket is going to have a couple of different attributes about it, so ways to describe the bucket. You've got the bucket's name, which we are going to signify by a piece of duct tape on the bucket, and we're going to call it var1. Important thing about variables. Variables cannot start with a number, so 1 var, not okay. Variables are case sensitive, so v with a capital V, AR1 is not the same as lowercase var1, which is not the same as v capital AR1. So those are all variable names. There are several different rules for variable names. For example, you can't do var space 1. But you can do an underline. So there are lots of rules, and honestly, the best way to learn the rules around variable names is to run into screwing them up. And we will show you, we will be going through errors a lot in this series. Essentially, that's kind of how you learn programming, is just screwing things up. So here's our name. We're going to signify it by writing it on duct tape, essentially on the front of this bucket. Another thing that variables have is a type. And in Python, types are not written explicitly. What that means is in other programming languages, you'll have int var1 equals 0. This has the type explicitly, so that's the type. It has the name, that's the name, and it has the value, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is an integer type, which is just a whole number without a decimal place. Its name is var1, and we're putting the value of 0 into it. In Python, you don't explicitly state the type, so it would just look like var1 equals 0. That is how you would write it. Also in Python, there are no semicolons required. I think there are some people who write semicolons. I don't think you get an error if you write semicolons, but they're not required. So don't worry about semicolons. All you need to learn is this right here. So the type is implicit. You're not going to actually explicitly set the type when you're writing the code. It's just implied with the value that you put in it. So the last kind of attribute, and the most important attribute of a variable in Python, is its value. Obviously, we don't want just to create variables. That's not very useful. So we're going to put something into that bucket. So if this is var1, we can put 0 into it, and that is going to set its implied type to integer, and we can throw cat into it, and that's going to set its implied type to string, which is just a group of characters all in a sequence, which is terminated by an invisible character called the string terminator. You won't actually see it within the code most of the time, but it is there. It's always present. It's like the god of programming, just ending strings wherever it wants to. So this is a string, and this is an integer. You can also put a float. So 1.1 is called a float in Python. That is just a decimal point number. And you've got a couple of other variable types that we will talk about later on in the series, but these are kind of the basic ones. So whenever you're referencing a bucket, later on in the code, if I were to write var1, and I wrote that out on the command line, it would print out what is in the variable, because what it's going to do is it's going to look for a bucket, and it's going to say, we're going to look for a bucket with the name var1. And once it finds that bucket with the name of var1, it's going to look in the bucket, and it's going to pull out whatever it finds. So in Python, it doesn't really care about the actual type of variable. It's just going to yank out whatever it finds in the bucket. So in this case, it could yank out 0, or it could yank out 1.1, or it could yank out cat. The Python doesn't care. As long as your code handles it well, as long as the instructions that you give to the computer handles it well, everything's hunky-dory. It doesn't really care about the type. So let's switch over to actually writing code. So like I said, this is what's called the interactive mode of idle. What that basically means is you write every line, piece by piece. And we're going to go over here in a second how to run it as a file instead of running it as a line. First, though, we're going to go over basic arithmetic. Idle in Python in general can be thought of as a really overly complicated calculator at first. So you can actually do calculations like 1 plus 1, 2 times 4, and 3 or 6 divided by 3. So all of these are perfectly legal, and this is how you would write all of them. The slash is the division mark, since you obviously don't have the typical like dot line dot division symbol, and the star or the asterisk, which is above the 8, is the symbol that you use for multiplication. There are also order of operations, so 2 times 4 plus 3 is going to equal 11 because it does everything correctly with respect to order of operations. You can also do 2 times 4 plus 3 and use parentheses, and that will give you something different because the order of operations changes. So all the mathematics, fairly simple. If you can do normal mathematics, it's, you know, obviously Python can do it way faster and way better because you start talking about 8,000 or 88,888 times 35. I'm not going to do that very quickly, but Python does it incredibly quickly. So what we are doing here is we are adding, multiplying, dividing, all of that with integers. We can also do it with floats, so 2.3 times 4.7, same exact thing. Python deals with all of the types and all of that on its own. You don't need to worry about typing it all out. So let's talk about variables with the actual code itself. So we've got variables. So var1 is the variable's name is equal to, let's just say 4. And let's print var1. So there are two different ways to print. One is the very basic way of just writing the variable name, and it will print it out. It'll look in that bucket, yank whatever it finds out of it, and go ahead and print it out. You can also use the print function. Functions are something that we are going to talk about later on, but you can use the print function to print out variables like that as well. They're very, very useful for strings and, you know, different things like that. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So that will also do the exact same thing. So like I said, this is the interactive mode, and the interactive mode is fine for learning how to kind of poke around. So you can also do var2 is equal to 7, and you can do basic arithmetic with variables. So var1 times var2, and you get 28 because that's 4 times 7, and you can just kind of play around with that. Really, there's not too much point in going too much further in interactive mode because the real power comes with running it as a file. So we're going to go up to File up in the upper left-hand corner and press New File, or we can just use the hotkey Control-N. I'm going to click that. Let me drag the window over, and you get a blank canvas to paint your code all over. So we can do the exact same thing here. var1 is equal to 3. We press Enter, and nothing happens. That's because we're running all of this as a file. So we're going to write all of our instructions out in a row first and then run it all at once. So I actually made an error here. So var1 equals 3, var2 is equal to 75, and we're going to use the print function because you can't actually just write the variable name with these scripts. I don't believe, at least. It's not the best way to do it. And we're going to use the print function, which is the keyword print, which turns purple because it's called a reserved word within Python. That means that it is a word that does something very specific in Python, and you can't use it as a variable name. So we start with print, we open a parentheses, and we put whatever we want to print in the middle of it. So var1 times var2. So that is going to calculate the results of var1 times var2 and then print out those results because they're between these parentheses right here. Like I said, we're going to talk about functions later on, but this is kind of just going to cover the basics of variables first, and then we're going to kind of build on top of it. So in order to run this file, we need to press Control-S to save it. So we're going to save this file as, let's just say, basic01.py. Save, and now we can run it. So you can either go up to Run and Run Module, or you can just press F5. So it immediately prints out 225. Now the real power for this comes when you start writing several hundred lines, and you need them all to run essentially at the same time. There's a lot of complexity behind it. Right now, honestly, we're only writing, 5 or 6 lines of code. So we've been working with integers and floats essentially this entire time. Let's do something with string. So let's do string 1 is equal to cat. So we're going to print string 1. So this should run all in order, basically setting var1 equal to 3, var2 equal to 75, and printing var1 times var2. Then it's going to set string 1 equal to cat, and then print string 1. So we should get to, I think it was 225 and then cat. So let's save this and run it again. We get 225 and cat. Very basic stuff, but all of this, like I said, is going to build on top of itself. Now, what happens if we try to add 2 strings? So let's do string 2 is equal to dog, and we're going to print string 2. Now what happens if we print string 1 plus string 2? Essentially, our mind says that we're adding these two things together, but adding cat plus dog doesn't quite make sense. And that's when we start getting into something called string concatenation. So let's save this and run it, and we get printed cat dog. And here's why. This is saying take string 1 and append string 2 to the end of it. It sounds basic, but this actually trips up quite a few people. Because obviously 1 plus 2 is very simple. You get 3. That's an addition thing. But you can also add two strings together. It's not actually adding them like mathematically. It's appending them to each other. And if we reverse the order, so if we change this to string 2 plus string 1, then we will get dog cat. So it reverses the order. So the order matters here, whereas it doesn't matter with addition of like two integers or two floats. Now, you might be asking yourself, what happens if we try to add a string plus a number? So print var1, which is 3, plus string 2. And let's see what happens. We get a type error, and this is going to be the first of many, 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 many errors that you deal with in Python. And we can kind of, we can look at this and break it down, fairly easily. I'm going to show you a great hot tip for idle. Go over to your code window, go to show line numbers under options, click that, and you get your line numbers. That's going to be very easy, or that's going to make it a lot easier to go through these errors. This says we have an error on line 12, and it says unsupported operand types for plus, int and string. So we go back here, we go look at line 12, which is this one right here, and we're seeing, oh, we're adding an integer to a string. That's not really allowed in Python. What's weird is that you can put integers within strings. So it's perfectly fine for me to do string 3 is equal to dog 3. That is perfectly fine. So we can print that out, string 3. And let's go ahead and get rid of this line right here since it's going to give us an error. So this is perfectly fine. It creates that perfectly fine. You just can't explicitly add an integer and a string together. Those are two different types that don't work well together. You can add integers together, you can add integers and floats together. You can add floats and floats together. You can add strings together, and that's called string concatenation, which is just putting the two strings together. But you cannot explicitly, and we'll show you a way later on to actually, essentially get the same effect, but you cannot add an integer and a string together, or a float and a string together. They have to be what's called casted, which we will talk later on. That's not advanced. It's essentially you're taking the integer and you're making it a string. So explicitly changing it from var1 equals 3 to changing it to a string by, essentially doing it that way. That changes it to a string variable instead of an integer. But we will talk about casting a little bit later on. It's not super relevant for the very beginning of talking about variables. And that's it. I know this may be a little bit confusing if you haven't done coding before, but read over this code, watch this episode a couple of times if you need to, slow it down, and most importantly, download Python, open up idle, and actually do this stuff yourself. Actually, try it out. The coolest thing about computer science and the coolest thing about coding is that you can try all of this stuff out at home. With stuff like physics and chemistry and all of this other stuff, you have to have very expensive equipment and really complicated, science know-how, and you can't just try it out at home like you can with coding. With coding, you just open up a window and you give it a try. So download it, try it out at home, see, what you can break. Find some errors, find some things that you don't quite understand, and Google it. Until then, I'm going to be releasing one of these videos probably once a week or something like that. So come back to the channel and we will start talking about more fundamentals of Python. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like the content, if you learned something from it, I would really appreciate it if you gave me a like, subscribe to watch some more stuff. I do all kinds of development stuff on here, anything from C and C++ to Python to all kinds of cool stuff. And I've got some really awesome stuff planned for the future, including the continuation of this series. Take it easy. Peace.